Earlier this week, I was with this person listening to stories. She was telling a story of when she was little, her mother was teaching Sunday school, and it was kind of a wintry morning, it was kind of wintry, and as each kid got ready to go outside and head out, each kid would come up to her and ask for her help to put on her boots and their mittens. And if any of you have worked with little kids, you know that can be a tedious task, but they need the help, right? So each little kid got their boot put on, got their whole snowsuit zipped up. Up they got it. She patiently waited. This was her mom, and so she patiently waited to the end of the line. She said, I remember as clear as if it was yesterday. It got to be my turn, and she looked at me and said, you know how to do it, just do it. And we know that feeling, don't we? The weeds and the chaff. And yet for her, that memory is just like the epitome of her mother. Her mother was a minister, her mother did all kinds of different denominations a long time ago, but her mother was seen out in the world teaching Sunday school and doing but when it came to her, you just go do it. We hear in the gospel message from Matthew today, and this is the story is the only one, Matthew is the only one that has this story. We hear that we are all both. We hear, why is it, God, why is it that you planted weeds? Let's just remove them. Let's take away all the hard stuff. Jesus, we can do this. We can get rid of the weeds. The particular weed, some would say, and I decided not to go down this road because I would say it wrong. There's a particular weed that you probably know that actually goes right around the plant. And theologians and scholars believe that's what Jesus was talking about. Not the weed that is growing far too fast in my backyard, but the kind of weed that goes right around the stalk that's growing. So as it all came up together. Just like us. It all came up together. We like to think that we're all so unique, and we are. We are blessedly unique creatures of God. We each have our own story. And we perhaps look out across the world. You know, I remember as a teenager, back then we had malls. And I remember as a teenager, like walking through the mall and thinking, well, her life must be perfect. Wow, if I looked like her, I'd be okay. You look at everybody else and you think, their life must be perfect. Yo, amen. But we know now, many of us, if we've grown up a little bit and we've lived enough life and maybe we've had the opportunity to hear enough people's stories, we now know we are all beloved children of God on the path with our own stories. We have those stories that are hard, and we have those stories that are blessing. Jesus had the wisdom. God had the wisdom, even though it might have been nice to think, if we were all just happy, clappy, no trauma, no history, we made no mistakes. I don't know. I'm twisted enough to think that would be boring. But I know that perhaps people wish that was the case, but it is really only in our humanity that we grow, isn't it? It is really only with our relationships with each other that we get to know ourselves and we get to know each other, and ultimately, as Christian people, we get to know God. A writer and author, Gabriel Marquez, says, what matters in life is not what happens to you, but what you remember and how you tell that story and what we do with the story. What we do with the story, because we all have choices. We all have choices. Jesus speaks to us today about a reality that it would be so nice to pretend that either as individuals we, no, I don't have a dark side. No, I wasn't the mother, as Tinker's laughing, and I would have also laughed. I'm sure my daughter has a list. I am glad she doesn't live around here, because she loves to walk into a place where I'm a priest. Yes, he's laughing. She loves to walk into a place where I'm the clergy person and remind them just how I'm human. And I will report to you, she's absolutely right. We are human, but we are also, as we grow and learn, we get to find ways to live that out, don't we? Jesus says, no, it will all be harvested. And we hate that with the lines in this gospel, priests, all clergy, all, I don't want to preach on that gnashing of teeth, throwing in fire. Well, first of all, we don't get the choice often. But second of all, is there something in your life, is there something in your past, is there something in your day that makes the consequences of it feel awful? I don't think God's going to throw me in fire. I don't think God's going to do that to you, but there have been times in my life where, boy, the consequences felt hard and painful. And God was always there. I always had someone to lead me out of that hard, dark place. That's where the grace is. So when the weeds grow, we hear in the gospel this morning, no, you can't pull them out because you can't just ignore them. Oh, but wouldn't we like to? So I'm going to suggest that our relationship with God is all about relationship. And how is it that we can make that be transformative? How is it that the relationships in our lives, I hope each one of you can sit here this morning, or maybe when you're sitting somewhere this afternoon, think about someone in your life that really changed it. Maybe it's a big thing, maybe it's a little thing, but people in our lives are how God shows up for us over and over and over again. One of the ways that we will know when that happens is if we know our story. Do you know your story? Maybe you know bits and pieces. Have you ever had the chance to share it with somebody? If you never have, or you'd like to, call me. Call a friend. If you see someone in the congregation, say, you know what, can we do coffee? But know your story, because if you think about your story, God is in it. If you are here on this beautiful July morning, there is some part of you that wants to see God in that story instead of being at the beach. Thank you, Alex. Alex loves the beach. God lives at the beach. You know I believe that. The other thing about relationships is notice things. When people tell you the story, when this woman was telling me the story about her mother and the different things that happened, and her mother was a minister. We were doing this as we were traveling. She wanted to show me the church that her mother used to preach in. She wanted me to sit with her and see where her mother used to preach. She would tell you that she's not sure she's a believer. I always tell her, I'm not sure about that, but this mother that just always told everybody else about the holy had such a hard time acting loving to her daughter. And yet all these years later, her mother's been gone a long time, all these years later, she wanted to show me that space. Not in a way that said, oh, my damn mother is here. It was in a look. Isn't it beautiful? All these years later, it was still, isn't it beautiful? So notice those times, because God is in our midst. In the midst of the painful story of her and her mother is also so much grace that she wanted to share. If you have someone else, supportive relationships with people, I know it sounds so touchy-feely and kumbaya, but sometimes just sitting and sharing your story, hearing each other's stories is so powerful. And isn't it great to have people in your life? How often maybe have you said, if you're lucky, if you said, we don't see each other for a really long time, but we pick up right where we left off. But sometimes it's hard. I was also listening to some stories this week, and this couple, there's a couple that lives behind them, and they're not exactly of the same political. It's just there's a little bigger gap in maybe what they think. And so they didn't know how that was going to go, because you don't know anymore. Right? Maybe you never did, but in this day and age, it's kind of like we know we're supposed to just, be kind. It's on the back of my car, just be kind. They've become friends. I still know that they don't necessarily agree on some things, but there was a story about the elderly gentleman getting a new chainsaw and being very excited and coming over and saying, "Would you like your wood cut?" How is it that we can be in relationship, whether it's those relationships that are deep, or whether it's just being, can we treat our neighbor as ourselves, as God would treat us? Yeah, I'd love to have my wood cut with your brand new chainsaw. Lastly, how do we respond with love, especially if we haven't been treated with love? How do we respond with love when that wasn't modeled for us? How do we respond with love when we don't feel lovable? We find places that teach us. We remind us, those of you that, you poor things, listen to me day in and day out. You know what I say every day. And it occurred to me far longer than it should have. That you preach what you most need to hear, right? Every single day, I say to whoever's listening, remember that God loves you beyond your wildest imagination. And at the core of who we are, no matter where we come from, no matter how we were treated, how is it that we can start to let that in? Because if we can start to believe it, I can tell you, it changes you. It's the only reason I'm here. It changes you. If you start to let God, find God's way in places you least expect it, whether it's the neighbor with the brand new chainsaw or the family member that says, I'm not a believer, but can I show you my church? I'm not a believer, but God comes and shows us in the most unlikely places when we can be open and prayerful. That same person had not seen this church and wanted to see it, so I brought her in, and she knows me not in the church context, so she was like, wow. But as we walked in, there was a sparrow that must have been let in somehow, and it had hit a wall, and it had died. And as the property committee can tell you, I don't do dead animals well. I'm sorry, that's one of my weeds. But usually that is an area I feel very comfortable asking for help and do often when needed. So we saw this sparrow, it was out there in the hallway. She was more upset than I was, which I'm sorry about, but she was. And so she noticed the sparrow, and then we walked in and we did the church. Then she came in and she got one of these Kleenexes, and she took the sparrow and she put it in the garden very carefully, very lovingly. I thanked her. She said to me the next day, she just had this image of this, she woke up in a dream and she just had this sparrow flying away. She said, I think the sparrow made it to heaven. But as she's walking out here as a person who doesn't believe, and she'd spent all day telling me these stories about her mother and feeling less than, even though her mother was this bigger than life person that helped so many people, was a prolific and wonderful writer and had so many gifts, but had difficulty sharing them with her daughter. She knows what I do. And so she's walking up, I'm walking down, I turned the lights off, we're walking down. I say, she goes, you are doing my funeral, you know, I just want you to know that. I said, I know. Just better not be for a long time. We don't know who is going to be in our life. We don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know how God is going to form our story. And even if it has been a hard story, there is so much room for grace and hope. And you can be the agent for that. God longs for you to be that healing for yourself and for the world around you. I finish up, many of you know we use this book for Lent. This is a book called The Lives We Actually Have. And this is a prayer in this book that I'll end with today called For Finding Grace for Others and Ourselves. Blessed are we, the graced, we who don't deserve it, whose failures haunt us, the things we said, the things left unsaid, the decisions and addictions and broken relationships that have ripple effects we still feel today. Somehow we are the recipients of this mysterious gift. Grace doesn't ease the pain or harm we've caused, but grace still, for us, the redeemable. And if we are, that means they are too. Yes, even them, the rude neighbor, the estranged father, the unforgiving ex, the boss who screwed you over and the doctor who messed up, the selfish pastor, the family member who did the unthinkable. Despite what we all have done and left undone, we are graced. Blessed are all of us who wrestle with unforgiveness and ungrace. You who make amends, you who reach for forgiveness, you who say you're sorry, even when sorry will never be enough. You who find the bridge to forgive the wrong done to you, even when you cannot forget, or can't go back, or they aren't nearly sorry enough. Blessed are we who live here in this mystery, this scheme of grace.